At 1:05 a.m. on June 6, 1944, Private Marcus Heim forced himself through the exit of a C-47 Sky train 2,000 feet above Normandy, observing tracer fire cutting the darkness beneath. 20 years old, his first combat jump, 0 kills. The 82nd Airborne Division was dropping 6,400 paratroopers onto the Cottonton Peninsula with a single objective: seize the bridges over the Murderette River before German reinforcements could get to Utah Beach. Without those crossings, the whole D-Day invasion might collapse in hours. Heim landed 25 feet from a dirt path. Before he could put his rifle together, he heard a motorcycle coming. 2 German soldiers rode past just yards away. He remained flat in the mud and let them pass. Around him, paratroopers were dying in the flooded marshes. The Germans had inundated the Murderette Valley weeks before. What should have been a small river was now a swamp 1,000 yards wide. Men weighed down with 70 lobbies of gear sank directly to the bottom. By morning, battalion commanders were discovering empty parachutes floating in 3 feet of water. Heim moved inland and located 11 men from A Company, 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment. Their objective was the Fière Bridge, 2 miles west of Sainte-Mère-Église. The bridge spanned a stone causeway 500 yards long. It was the sole dry path west of the Murderette. If the Germans kept it, American forces advancing from Utah Beach would be confined to the coast. The invasion would halt before it could start. Lieutenant John Dolan gathered 90% of A Company by 6 a.m. Most units were scattered over 10 miles of French countryside that night. The 505th had practiced night jumps in England. They knew how to locate each other in the dark. They had rehearsed the mission until every soldier could navigate it blind. Dolan guided them toward the bridge through hedgerows and farm fields. At the manor house next to La Fière, they discovered 28 entrenched German infantrymen. After 30 minutes of close-quarters combat with grenades and rifles, the manor was clear. At 1:45 p.m., 2 men patrolled the bridge itself. German soldiers concealed on the far side attempted to ambush them. Private James Mattingly shot the first, then wounded and captured the others. The bridge was clear. A company set up a 9-man force at the western end in the hamlet of Coquigny. They obstructed the causeway with a German truck and set anti-tank mines near it. Heim was put on a bazooka team with PFC Leonard Peterson. Peterson was Swedish. He spoke almost no English, but he could aim a rocket better than anyone in the company. They dug in behind a concrete telephone pole near the manor, facing west toward Coquigny. The pole was 2 feet thick. It would block small arms fire, but not heavier rounds. 2 other bazooka men, John Boulderson and Gordon Prime, took a position on the other side of the road. Behind them, a 57mm anti-tank gun and a machine gun covered the causeway. The problem was straightforward. The Germans had tanks. A company had bazookas and rifles. Major Frederick Kellum, commanding 1st Battalion, knew what was headed their way. Every man at La Fière knew the causeway was a kill zone. No protection for 500 yards. Anyone crossing it would be undefended from both sides, and German armor was gathering in Coquigny. At 4 p.m., shells started striking the manor. German mortars targeted their fire along the Murderette's eastern bank. The manor's stonework absorbed most of the shrapnel. A rumor went through a company that a counterattack was building. Heim inspected his rockets. Peterson checked the sight on the bazooka. They had 6 rounds total. The 57mm gun had perhaps 20 shells. That was the only thing between 3 German tanks and the road to Sainte-Mère-Église. If you want to know how Heim's desperate bazooka stand concluded, please click that like button. It assists us in sharing these forgotten battles with more people. Subscribe if you're not already. Back to Heim. At 5 p.m., Heim heard the noise he'd been fearing since morning. Tank tracks, metal scraping on stone, coming from Coquigny. Peterson lifted his head above the foxhole and peered down the causeway. 3 tanks, infantry with them, all moving straight for the La Fière Bridge. The 3 tanks were Renault R35s. French tanks captured in 1940. The Germans used them for training units and static defense. Each one weighed 10 tons and had a 37-millimeter gun in its turret. Against infantry, they were deadly. The Renault had 12 millimeters of armor on its sides. A bazooka could pierce 8 inches of steel at a close distance, but the team had to make the shot count. Heim and Peterson watched the lead tank come around the curve in the causeway 400 yards out. Infantry advanced on both sides of the road, about 30 men. Behind the first tank was a second, then a third. The German commander knew the causeway was tight. He was using the tanks for cover. The infantry would trail them across and overrun the American position by sheer force of numbers. Peterson loaded a rocket. Heim kneeled beside him with 3 more rounds prepared. On the opposite side of the road, Boulderson and Prime did the same. The 57-millimeter gun crew adjusted their aim. The machine gun in the manor yard opened up first. Tracer rounds flew across the causeway toward the German infantry. Men fell. Others scattered into the marsh on either side. The lead tank advanced. Its commander stood up in the turret to get a better look at the bridge. He was about 20 meters from the western end of the causeway when the machine gun hit him. A burst struck him in the chest. He dropped back into the turret. The tank slowed but did not stop. It kept moving forward. Peterson fired. The rocket launched from the tube with a pop and a flash of backblast. It struck the front glacis of the Renault and exploded. The tank jerked to the right, but continued. Peterson reloaded. Boulderson fired from the other side of the road. His rocket struck the same tank in the side. It still advanced. The 57-millimeter gun fired. The shell penetrated the turret ring. The tank stopped. Smoke billowed from the hatches. The second tank attempted to get around the first. The causeway was just wide enough for one vehicle. The Renault's right track slipped into the marsh. It fought to get itself back onto the road. Peterson fired again. The rocket struck the turret, dead center. The tank stopped moving. No fire, no smoke, just stopped. The third tank was retreating. Its commander had seen enough. 2 tanks burning or disabled in under 2 minutes. He reversed down the causeway toward Coquigny. German infantry attempted to advance without armored support. The machine gun and rifle fire from A Company cut them to pieces. Bodies accumulated on both sides of the road. Then the turret of the first tank started to move. It wasn't destroyed. The crew was still alive. The gun barrel swung toward Heim and Peterson's position. Heim saw it turning. 37mm high explosive. If that gun fired, the concrete pole would be gone. So would they. Peterson was reloading. Heim grabbed his shoulder. They tumbled out of the foxhole and scrambled 10 feet to the left. The tank fired. The shell hit the concrete pole exactly where they had been crouching 2 seconds before. The blast shattered 2 feet of reinforced concrete. Debris rained down on the road. Heim felt the blast in his chest. Peterson didn't pause. He knelt on the open road, bazooka on his shoulder. No cover, no concealment. German riflemen were firing at him from 300 yards. He aimed at the disabled Renault and fired. The rocket hit the engine. This time the tank ignited. Heim searched for the third tank. It had stopped retreating. It was turning back. Coming again. The third tank advanced cautiously down the causeway. Its commander had seen 2 Renaults be destroyed. He wouldn't make the same errors. The tank moved in short advances. 5 yards. Stop. 5 more yards. The turret swiveled left and right, searching for targets. Heim counted his rockets. 2. Peterson had 1 loaded. 3 total against a tank now anticipating bazooka fire. The 57mm gun behind them was quiet. Heim looked back. The gun crew was dead. A German mortar shell had landed directly in their position. Peterson fired at the third tank. The rocket struck the front armor and glanced off. Bad angle. The Renault advanced. It was 200 yards from the bridge. Now Heim loaded Peterson's final rocket. 1 shot. If they missed, the tank would get to the bridge. Once it crossed, it could turn north toward Sainte-Mère-Église. The entire American position would fall. Heim then remembered the anti-tank team that had been killed near the 57mm gun. They'd been carrying rockets. He told Peterson to hold position and keep shooting his rifle. Then he ran. German infantry on the far side of the causeway saw him move. Rifle fire snapped across the road. Bullets struck the stone wall of the manor. Heim stayed low and got to the dead gun crew. 3 men lay sprawled around the wrecked 57mm. One of them had a canvas bag. Heim seized it. 4 rockets inside. He ran back to Peterson. The third tank was 150 yards from the bridge. Peterson was kneeling in the open road with his M1 carbine, firing at German infantry. Rounds were hitting the pavement around him. Heim slid into position and loaded a fresh rocket into the bazooka. Peterson dropped the carbine and took the launcher. He aimed at the Renault's side armor as it turned slightly on the tight causeway. The angle was better. He fired. The rocket hit just below the turret. The tank stopped. No fire, no explosion, just stopped. The engine had died or the crew was dead. Across the road, Boulderson and Prime finished off what was left of the second tank with their last rocket. 3 Renaults disabled or burning on a 500-yard stretch of road. The German infantry started to fall back toward Coquigny. They had lost their armor. Without tanks, they couldn't get across the causeway. Then something unforeseen occurred. A soldier emerged from a ditch on the American side. His name was Joe Fitt. He'd been pinned by rifle fire for the last 10 minutes. Now he saw an opportunity. He ran to the first burning Renault. German infantry was still close enough to shoot him. They did. Fitt got onto the tank. He pulled a grenade from his webbing, pulled the pin, and dropped it through the turret hatch. 3 seconds later, the grenade exploded inside. The tank was done. The German attack faltered. Infantry fell back down the causeway toward Coquigny. Mortar fire ceased. For the first time in an hour, the shooting lessened to occasional rifle shots. Heim and Peterson remained in their foxhole. They braced for a second wave. It never came. After 10 minutes, they looked around. The machine gun post in the manor yard was unmanned. The crew was killed or wounded. The 57mm was gone. They couldn't see anyone else from A Company. Heim believed they might be the only ones left. He thought the bridge might have fallen everywhere but their position. Then someone came down the road from Sainte-Mère-Église, a lieutenant. He told them to hold their ground. Reinforcements were en route. The Germans might try again. Heim and Peterson stayed in the foxhole behind the remains of the concrete pole. Around them, the causeway was covered with German bodies and 3 burning French tanks. By night, Heim learned what happened. Of the few men holding the bridge that afternoon, most were killed or wounded. A company had lost 17 dead and 51 wounded in a single day. But they still held La Fière Bridge, and the Germans knew it would cost them dearly to retake it. On the night of June 6th, a company was relieved by units of the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment. Heim and Peterson finally left their foxhole. They had been there for 18 hours. When they got up, their legs hardly worked. They moved back toward Sainte-Mère-Église to regroup. Behind them, the causeway at La Fière stayed a no-man's land. German artillery shelled the eastern side of the bridge all night. American mortars hit Coquigny on the western side. No one could cross in either direction. The 3 destroyed Renault tanks sat on the causeway as monuments to the day's combat. On June 7th, the 325th Glider Infantry Regiment landed in Waco and Horsa gliders in fields east of the Murderette. Most gliders crashed. Wooden frames broke against hedgerows and trees, but 90% of the regiment was assembled in hours. Their mission was to break the impasse at La Fière. General James Gavin, Assistant Division Commander of the 82nd Airborne, took personal command of the area. Gavin saw the problem. The causeway was a death trap. 500 yards of open road, no cover. German machine guns and mortars had every inch ranged. Anyone attempting to cross would be cut to ribbons. But the 4th Infantry Division was advancing inland from Utah Beach. They needed the road west. Without La Fière Bridge, the entire Cottontail Peninsula campaign would stop. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Timms was stuck on the western side of the Murderette with parts of 2 companies from the 507th PIR. He'd been cut off since D-Day. His men held an orchard east of Amfreville. Germans surrounded them on 3 sides. Timms had no radio contact with division. He sent patrols toward La Fière, but they couldn't get through. On June 8th, Gavin ordered Major Teddy Sanford to take 1st Battalion, 325th Glider Infantry, across the river north of the causeway. Timms's men had located a shallow ford, maybe 3 feet deep. Sanford's battalion advanced at night. They got halfway across before German forces counterattacked. Machine gun fire and mortars hit the column in the water. Men fell in the darkness. Sanford pulled his battalion back. The ford was impassable. Another force under Colonel George Millet tried to advance west from Amfreville to link up with Timms. The Germans were ready. Millet and several of his men were captured. The rest were pushed northeast toward the river. Every attempt to go around the causeway had failed. The Germans held Coquigny in force. They were not giving up the western end of the bridge. By June 8th, Gavin had no more options. The 4th Infantry Division was right behind him. 7th Corps needed that road open now. There was only one option left, a frontal attack, straight down the causeway. Gavin gave the mission to the 325th Glider Infantry Regiment, specifically 2nd Battalion 401st GIR, attached to the 325th as its 3rd Battalion. The battalion commander was Lieutenant Colonel Charles Carrel. Carrel's men had no combat experience. They'd landed by glider on June 7th, less than 48 hours in Normandy. Now they were being ordered to make what everyone knew was a suicide run. 500 yards, no cover. German machine guns, mortars, and artillery waiting. The officers called it a kamikaze mission. The men concurred. Gavin met with Carrel on the evening of June 8th. He laid out the mission. At dawn on June 9th, the battalion would attack across the causeway. 12 Sherman tanks from the 746th Tank Battalion would give covering fire. 155mm guns from the 90th Division Artillery would shell Coquigny for 15 minutes before the assault. But then, the glidermen would have to cross by foot. Carrel heard the plan. He looked at the causeway. He looked at his men. Then he looked back at Gavin. He said he understood, but in his eyes, Gavin saw something he didn't like. Doubt, fear, reluctance. The assault was set for 10:30 a.m. on June 9th. Carrel had 12 hours to prepare his battalion. 12 hours before they would charge into the most intense fire any of them had ever witnessed. 12 hours before La Fière Bridge would be secured or lost for good. At 6:00 a.m. on June 9th, Captain John Sauls walked the length of the stone wall near La Fière Manor. His company, G Company, 325th Glider Infantry Regiment, was spread out behind the wall. The men were silent. They had spent the night seeing bodies from earlier attacks floating in the marsh next to the causeway. They knew what was next. Sauls had asked for smoke shells to screen the assault. Division said no, not enough smoke rounds on hand. The tanks and artillery would have to be enough. Sauls looked at the causeway. 500 yards of flat road. The old plane trees lining it had been decimated by days of shelling. No cover left, just open road under German observation. Behind the manor, 12 Sherman tanks from the 746th Tank Battalion got into position on a ridgeline. Their commanders sighted the guns on Coquigny. German positions were visible with binoculars, machine gun nests, mortar pits, infantry in the rubble of stone houses. The Shermans would fire over the heads of the advancing glidermen. It was better than nothing, but not much. At 10:00 a.m., General Gavin found Lieutenant Colonel Carrel near the starting point. Carrel had been slightly wounded in the glider landing 2 days prior. Not serious, but he looked wan. His hands were unsteady as he held the map. Gavin asked if the battalion was set. Carrel said yes, but his voice lacked certainty. Gavin had no time for uncertainty. He told Carrel to get his men moving. The barrage would begin in 30 minutes. At 10:45, the glidermen would go. Carrel nodded. He walked back to his battalion. Gavin watched him leave and felt a pit in his stomach. Something was off. At 10:30 a.m., the artillery barrage started. 150 infantry guns from the 90th Division hit Coquigny for 15 minutes. Shells flew overhead and exploded in the hamlet. Stone houses fell. Dust and smoke rose over the western end of the causeway. The Shermans added their fire. 75mm rounds hit German positions along the marsh. The sound was deafening. Men kneeled behind the stone wall, hands over their ears. Captain Robert Ray stood nearby with 90 paratroopers from the 507th PIR. Gavin had told him to be ready. If the 325th faltered under fire, Ray's men would charge the causeway and take over. Ray knew what that meant. The glider men were new. They'd never seen combat. Under heavy machine gun fire, they might freeze. Ray's paratroopers were experienced. They would get the job done if needed. At 10:45, the barrage stopped. Silence descended on La Fière. For 10 seconds, no one moved. Then Gavin gave the command. Attack. Carrel was meant to lead his battalion, but he didn't budge. Gavin went up to him and repeated the command. Carrel said he didn't feel right. The wound from the glider crash was hurting him. He couldn't lead the charge. Gavin looked at him for 3 seconds. Then he relieved Carrel of command on the spot. Major Arthur Gardner took command of 2nd Battalion, 401st GIR instantly. Gardner was already in motion. He'd seen Carrel pause. He knew what was necessary. He found Captain Sauls and told him to get G Company ready. Sauls nodded. He'd already cleared the bodies of dead paratroopers from behind the stone wall. His men had witnessed enough death. They didn't need more reminders. Sauls looked down the line at his men. Most were 18 or 19. They'd been in the army less than a year. Now they were about to run across a 500-yard kill zone into German machine guns. He wondered what to say. There was nothing to say. He checked his carbine. He took a breath. Then he leapt over the stone wall and shouted 2 words, "Follow me!" G Company surged from behind the stone wall and ran for the causeway. Sauls was out front. Behind him came 80 men with rifles, bars, and ammo. They hit the bridge at a run. German machine guns opened up right away. The first man dropped 10 yards onto the causeway, shot in the chest. He fell without a sound. 2 more fell before the company got to the middle of the bridge. Bullets snapped past at waist level. Ricochets sparked off the stone. Sauls kept running. If he stopped, they all would. If they stopped on the causeway, they would all die. The Shermans were firing from the ridge behind La Fière Manor. 75mm rounds flew over the heads of the charging glidermen and exploded in Coquigny. The noise was overwhelming. Men couldn't hear commands. They couldn't hear each other. They could only see the man ahead and keep going. 100 yards onto the causeway, the German mortars zeroed in. 81mm rounds exploded on the road. Shrapnel tore through the column. Men fell in groups of 3 and 4. The causeway was slick with blood. Soldiers jumped over bodies and kept running. There was no other option. Forward was death. Back was death. The only choice was forward. Faster. E Company followed G Company onto the causeway, then F Company. The whole battalion was in. Over 400 men charging down a road barely wide enough for 2 soldiers abreast. German artillery joined the mortars. 105mm shells landed in the glidermen. The blasts threw bodies into the marsh on both sides. Captain Ray watched from behind the wall. He was ordered to charge if the 325th faltered. But they weren't faltering. They were dying, but they weren't stopping. Ray saw men crawling forward on shattered legs. He saw soldiers carrying wounded comrades on their backs while bullets hit all around. The glidermen were raw troops, but they were proving their mettle in the worst possible way. Halfway across, a Sherman hit one of its own mines. The Americans had set anti-tank mines on June 6th to stop German armor. No one had removed them before the charge. The Sherman blew up and blocked half the road. Men had to file past the burning tank one by one. German machine gunners focused fire on that bottleneck. Bodies piled up near the wreck. Saul's got to the western end of the causeway. Coquigny was just ahead. Stone buildings, hedgerows, German infantry shooting from every window. He dove into a ditch by the road. G Company's survivors fell in after him. Maybe 40 men left from 80. They decrossed 500 yards under fire and lost half the company. But they were across, the first American bridgehead on the west side of the Meurderay. E Company came up behind them. Then parts of F Company. The Germans threw everything at the western end of the causeway. Machine guns, mortars, rifle grenades. The Americans were trapped in ditches and couldn't push into Coquigny proper. Then the German counterattack began. Infantry from the 91st Luftlande Division moved from the hamlet in force, perhaps 200 men. They struck the American bridgehead from 3 sides. The glidermen were outnumbered, cut off from support. The causeway behind them was still under fire. No one could cross to reinforce. Captain Wayne Pierce, commanding C Company, 325th Glider Infantry, was advancing on the left flank. His lead platoon got into Coquigny itself. Then German forces surrounded them. The platoon was cut off 40 yards ahead of the main American line. Machine gun fire and rifle grenades pinned them in a roadside ditch. German infantry was moving to flank them. In moments, the platoon would be overrun. Private First Class. Charles de Glopper saw it happening. 22 years old from Grand Island, New York. He had a Browning automatic rifle. He'd been in the Army for 18 months, never in combat until 3 days ago. Now he was seeing his platoon destroyed. De Glopper made a choice. He told his squad to retreat through a gap in the hedgerow behind them. Then he stood up. De Glopper walked from the ditch onto the road in full sight of the German positions. He raised his Browning automatic rifle and fired a burst at the nearest machine gun nest. 20 rounds. The gun stopped. He advanced. German infantry shifted their fire from the retreating platoon to the lone soldier in the open. Rifle fire hit de Glopper in the left shoulder. The force spun him around. He steadied himself and kept shooting. Short, controlled bursts, another machine gun nest, then a group of German soldiers moving through a hedgerow. He could see his squad crawling back through the gap to friendly lines. They were getting out. That was all that mattered. A second bullet hit him in the side. He staggered but didn't go down. Blood soaked his uniform. He dropped to one knee on the road, bracing the bar on his leg. His vision was tunneling. He could hardly see the German positions. He aimed at muzzle flashes and fired. The bar's barrel was smoking. He'd used 3 magazines, around 60 rounds. German soldiers were coming in from both sides. They saw he was alone. They saw he was hit. They advanced cautiously, expecting him to fall any second. De Glopper fired another burst. 2 Germans fell. The others took cover. Behind him, his squad got to the American lines. All 9 men. They had made it because of him. A third bullet hit de Glopper in the chest. This one pitched him forward onto his hands. The bar fell to the pavement. He reached for it. His hands weren't working. Everything seemed far away. He managed to pull the weapon up and brace it on the road. Still kneeling, still facing the Germans, he fired one last burst. Then a 4th bullet hit him in the neck. He fell sideways onto the road. The bar went quiet. German infantry advanced slowly. When they got to his position, they found him dead. Around him on the ground were 8 German soldiers he had killed in the last 2 minutes. 2 machine guns were silenced. The automatic weapons that had trapped his platoon were quiet. The bridgehead held. With de Glopper's sacrifice, Captain Pierce was able to regroup C Company and push into Coquigny. E Company and G Company linked up. By noon, American forces held the western end of the causeway in force. The Germans fell back toward Amfreville. The 91st Luftlande Division had lost too many men holding Coquigny. They couldn't push the Americans back over the Meurderay. General Gavin crossed the causeway that afternoon. He had to see the bridgehead himself. When he got to the western end, he paused and looked back at La Fière Manor. What he saw would be with him for the rest of his life. The causeway was covered in bodies. American soldiers lay where they had fallen in the assault. Some died instantly. Others had crawled on until they could not crawl anymore. Gavin later wrote he could have walked from the church at Coquigny back to Fière Bridge and never touched the ground. The bodies were that dense. He didn't know how many men the 325th had lost in the charge. Casualty reports would take days, but he knew it was over 200, maybe near 300. The worst losses in a single engagement the 82nd Airborne had suffered in the war yet. But Fière Bridge was secure. The causeway was open. On June 10th at 4 a.m., the 357th Infantry Regiment from the 90th Infantry Division crossed into the western Cotentin. They passed the destroyed Renault tank still in the middle of the road. They passed the burned Sherman. They passed bodies that hadn't been collected yet. The 4th Infantry Division came next. Then armor, then artillery. Everything bottled up east of the Murderette for 4 days was finally heading west. The German defense of the Cotentin Peninsula was breaking, and it all depended on 500 yards of stone causeway and the men who would not give it up. The Battle of Fière Bridge lasted 4 days, from June 6th to June 9th, 1944. In that time, over 250 American soldiers were killed, fighting for 500 yards of stone. Another 300 were wounded. The German 91st Luftlandedivision Division lost 2,212 men in the first 6 days of the Normandy campaign. Many died trying to hold or retake Fière. A company, 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, jumped into Normandy with 136 men. By the time they were relieved in July, 33 were left. The rest were killed, wounded, or missing. Marcus Heim and Leonard Peterson survived. So did John Boulderson and Gordon Prime. All 4 Bazooka men who took out 3 German tanks in 90 seconds on June 6th received the Distinguished Service Cross. It was the second highest award for bravery in the U.S. military. Private First Class Charles de Glopper did not survive. His body was recovered from the road in Coquigny. On February 28, 1946, his father accepted the Medal of Honor for him at a ceremony in Grand Island, New York. De Glopper was the only soldier from the 82nd Airborne Division to get the Medal of Honor for actions in Normandy. His citation told how he gave his life to save his squad, how he stood in plain sight of the enemy and drew their fire while his comrades got away, how his body was later found surrounded by dead Germans and silent machine guns. Official U.S. Army historian S.L.A. Marshall was there during the Normandy invasion. He interviewed survivors. He walked the ground. Years later, he wrote that Fière Bridge was the fiercest battle in the European war. Not the biggest, not the longest, but the fiercest. The most concentrated fighting in the smallest area over the shortest time. The strategic value of Fière cannot be exaggerated. Without that bridge, U.S. forces from Utah Beach would have been stuck on the coast. The Germans could have counterattacked from the west and pushed the invasion into the sea. The whole D-Day operation relied on the 82nd Airborne holding a few bridges over the Murderette River. Fière was the most vital, and it was held by a few hundred paratroopers and glidermen with bazookas and rifles against tanks in greater numbers. Today, the causeway at Fière is called Marcus Heim Way. A bronze statue called Iron Mike looks over the battlefield. It shows an airborne soldier at the moment of landing. The statue was dedicated on June 7, 1997. An identical statue is at Fort Benning, Georgia. Near the bridge is a memorial plaque with the names of 144 paratroopers from the 505th who were killed in action. Charles de Glopper has his own memorial stele at the western end of the causeway. Marcus Heim went home after the war. He lived until October 22, 2002. He was buried with full military honors in Middleburg, New York. He rarely talked about Fière. When asked, he just said it was one of the hardest days of his life. He said he didn't know why he and Peterson lived when so many others didn't. "Only the good Lord knows," he said. "If this story affected you the way it affected us, do me a favor. Click that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Click subscribe and turn on notifications. We're finding forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about paratroopers who held bridges with bazookas and courage. Real people, real heroism.